Welcome to Rise Full, where underdogs rise, justice wins, and every story reminds you, no one stays powerless forever. If you love courtroom twists, neighborhood drama, and real feeling battles for what's right, you're in the right place. I used to neutralize threats with nothing but a rope and my instincts. Now the HOA wants $100 over a potted plant. Life's got a dark sense of humor. They see a quiet man pruning hedges, sipping coffee, living slow. What they don't see is what happens when you back that man into a corner, especially when the one person he loves is dragged into the line of fire. This isn't a landscaping dispute, it's a declaration. And it all kicks off with one knock that rattled more than just the doorframe. Stick around, you're listening to a drama story from Riceville. My name is David Peterson, and if you think retirement means rest and relaxation, you've clearly never crossed a homeowners association ruled by a man with a badge and a god complex. This is how a peaceful home turned hostile. How I had to sharpen instincts I swore I'd buried. It began like most wars do, underestimated, unprovoked, and wrapped in fake smiles. Alina and I moved into Willowbrook 3 years ago thinking we'd found heaven on earth. Manicured lawns, quiet streets, cookie-cutter peace. Alina, my wife of 18 years, is a wizard with space. She built our backyard like it was something out of a resort catalog, complete with tiered beds, a stone fountain she drafted by hand, and a lighting scheme that made the nights feel like a dream. I handled the grunt work, the cuts, the trenches, the details. Neighbors always complimented my precision, not knowing that same perfection once meant keeping men alive. You don't forget the art of war, I'd say. You just learn to trim it with garden shears. Things unraveled fast when Richard Harrison was elected HOA president. The last guy was a retired teacher, kept things chill, made sure the grass didn't get wild. Richard, though, he walked in like he was storming Normandy, late 50s, military posture, but with that twitchy energy that said something deeper was wrong. He wore power like a cheap suit, loud, tight, and way too proud. First meeting he dropped regulations like a warlord. Grass couldn't grow past 2.5 inches. Doors needed pre-approval. Even flower pots needed clearance. That was his opening salvo. Our first violation came on a Tuesday. Crisp paper. $200 fine for a lawn that measured a whopping 3 inches. Alina lost it, measuring every blade. I paid it off calm as ever. That probably pissed her off more than the fine. 2 weeks later, new notice, our front door too vibrant. Same door we'd had for 3 years. Fine, $350. Elena started taking notes, real notes. She spotted Carol Jenkins, Richard's new sidekick, snapping photos from across the street like a pie with a grudge. Carol had lived here forever, but now she was suddenly HOA muscle. Then came the camera, hidden up on a utility pole, aimed right at us. Alina called the power company no record. That's when I knew it wasn't just overreach, it was surveillance. So I got to work. Cameras, sensors, all high grade but camouflaged as consumer tech. Alina caught me soldering wires at midnight. Feed running on a laptop that didn't come from Best Buy. She saw the old photo. Me in camo beside a sign that said Special Forces Operations Base. She didn't ask, but she looked at me different, like she finally saw the part I kept buried. Richard stared at me like he knew something, like he remembered. One day at the mailbox he asked if I'd ever served overseas. I gave him nothing, and he squinted like he was trying to piece together a ghost. Carol kept snapping photos. I caught her focusing on my arms. Probably saw the faded sealed trident, small worn, but if you know, you know. 4th week in, the fine was $750. Excessive garden decor, they called it. Alina was unraveling. And truth is, so was I, but I knew one thing. You don't go loud until the enemy reveals their position. I started archiving every violation, every camera angle, into a footlocker from my old life. Alina watched me do it. David, she said, voice trembling. You're not telling me everything, are you? I looked at her, the only person who never asked about the screams in my sleep, or the scars I never explained. And I realized Richard wasn't just drunk on power, he was hunting something. Maybe someone. Drop your wildest HOA story in the comments, because what happened next turned this into a battlefield. Some wars don't start with gunfire, they start with a clipboard and a grudge. Richard brought in enforcers, Max and Jake, Jim built, blank-eyed, ready to bully. They weren't here to issue citations, they were here to break people. I watched from the window as Richard pointed toward our home like he was marking a target. The escalation was surgical. Dead plants arranged like threats. Elena's car keywords carved, I won't repeat. Trash dumped at midnight. Cops brushed it off as teen pranks. But I knew better. Fear isn't loud, it's quiet. It creeps in with a smile and a clipboard. Alina began jumping at shadows, asking if we should move. And every time I looked at Richard's house, he was watching, hands behind his back, like he was conducting chaos. I made the call that morning. No more waiting, no more pretending. I told Alina I had errands. What I really meant was, it's time to remind them who I used to be. Instead, I spent the day shadowing Richard and studying his every move. What I uncovered confirmed the gut instinct I'd been trying to ignore. Richard wasn't acting alone, he was getting intel from someone else. Someone with access to my schedule and a reason to ruin me. I watched him meet a man I didn't recognize, jittery in a designer suit, who handed over a thick folder like it contained state secrets. They sat in Richard's car talking for nearly an hour, and though I couldn't hear a word, the tension between them spoke volumes. This wasn't harassment, it was a mission, and Alina and I were the targets. The ambush came on a Thursday morning, the one day I had a mandatory downtown meeting that couldn't be skipped. Alina was home alone. For at least 4 hours I should have counseled, should have trusted the voice in my head screaming at me to stay. But orders are orders, even from a civilian job, and my boss had made it clear. No show, no job. I kissed Alina goodbye and told her to call if anything felt wrong. That goodbye haunted me before I even hit the freeway. Around 10:30 I got her text, Carol and 2 big guys at door. Say emergency inspection. What do I do? I was already making a U-turn before I finished reading it, but I was stuck in gridlock hell 20 minutes out. I opened my security feed and watched in real time as a nightmare unfolded. Carol showed up first, clipboard in hand, with Max and Jake flanking her in fake uniforms. They claimed they'd received an anonymous tip about hazardous materials in our garage and had legal grounds to inspect for the community's safety. Alina, always believing in order and rules, let them in her first mistake. One I never should have let her make. From the second she opened that door, I knew everything was about to shatter. I weaved through traffic like a man possessed, flying through red lights with zero regard for the consequences. What they did next wasn't just destruction, it was psychological warfare. This wasn't vandalism. This was a message written in glass, blood, and broken memories. They shattered Elena's handmade pottery, demolished family photos, and stomped my framed commendations into the carpet. But what wrecked me most? They annihilated Elena's garden, ripping out flowers she planted by hand, smashing her fountain, beating our lights to pieces. I watched her cry on camera, begging them to stop, and they just laughed, cold and cruel. When Alina tried to call 911, Max snatched her phone and slammed it into the wall. Jake shoved her backward into the counter. When are you gonna learn? Max snarled, nose to nose with her. Nobody wants you here. Sell and vanish before it gets worse. They cornered her like animals, using size and fear as weapons. Jake grabbed her shoulders and shook her like a rag doll while Carol filmed the entire assault, smirking like she was capturing a moment of justice. This is what happens when you ignore the rules, she said, voice dripping with venom. Next time, maybe you'll understand how things work. I made a 20-minute drive in 12, running on rage and 20 years of combat reflexes I'd hoped to never need again. The front door was hanging open. Alina was sobbing. Max and Jake stood in the living room, smugly admiring their destruction, while Carol kept filming like a war tourist. They didn't hear me enter. That was their first mistake. Their second was turning their backs on the front door. Their third, thinking I was just a landscaper with calloused hands. I moved through the chaos like a whisper of death. Before they could react, Max was on the floor, screaming from a knee strike that collapsed him like dead weight. Jake turned fists up, but I caught his swing and dropped him with an uppercut that flipped his switch clean off. He crumpled next to Max like a marionette with cut strings. Carol froze, phone in hand, mouth wide, suddenly realizing this wasn't her HOA fairy tale anymore. I tied them with garden hose, knots tight enough to outlast panic, then rushed to Alina. She was trembling, in shock, but not bleeding. Are you hurt? I asked, scanning her with hands calm from years of crisis. No, she whispered. But David, who are you? I looked at the crumpled bodies on our floor and then at Carol, now pale as drywall and pressed into the corner like she could vanish. Those people, I said, voice cold as steel, just attacked my family. And now they get to meet the man my unit used to call Vulture. You don't earn a name like that by planting petunias. So, what did that name mean, and just how far was I about to go? If someone stormed your home and hurt the person you loved, how far would you go? Tell me in the comments, because trust me, this story's just getting warmed up. The calmest man in the room is the one you should fear most. He's the one who's already made peace with violence. The next few days were a blur of digging, connecting dots, and uncovering truths darker than we imagined. Elena's research skills, paired with my knowledge of military intel, cracked Richard's past wide open, and what we found chilled me to the bone. But before I tell you the full truth, you need to hear about the moment that flipped the script. The moment David Peterson, the quiet husband and ex-consultant, became something else entirely. The truth about my past was about to hit like a sledgehammer, and Richard Harrison, he was about to regret waking something that should have stayed buried. Elena's research unearthed enough to paint a picture. Richard had served, yes, but not honorably. His record was a mess of redacted files, mentions of misconduct, and an officer review board that ended his career. Digging deeper, we found references to a failed mission I remembered far too well, one that went sideways and cost lives. It was all there. Court-martial recommendations, breach of command, betrayal. Alina laid out the files across the table, her face pale with realization. David, she whispered, this isn't random. He knows you. I stared at the paperwork, that old familiar weight settling into my chest like it had never left. Then fate handed us the last puzzle piece. Our elderly neighbor came by to check on Alina after the break-in, over coffee. He said something casual that made my blood turn cold. Richard told me something strange once. He said, sipping slowly, said he moved here for a fresh start, but had an old score to settle with some special forces guy who ruined his career. Some ghosts don't haunt houses, they haunt each other. And Richard Harrison had just kicked in the wrong door. Asterisk, I didn't think much of it at the time. But now that I see what's happened to you, too, it makes a man wonder. Alina and I exchanged a glance that said everything without words. This wasn't random. This was vengeance slow-cooked and meticulously planned by someone who'd been nursing a grudge for over a decade. The final confirmation didn't come from some document or hunch. It came from Carolyn Whittingley. We found out she'd been feeding Richard reports with obsessive precision. Alina, using skills I hadn't realized she possessed, intercepted one of Carol's files through a feed-up neighbor who'd grown tired of being part of their twisted campaign. The report was a dossier on me. Photos of my tattoos taken with a zoom lens, a daily timeline of my movements, and disturbingly accurate speculation about my military background. But the most damning piece was a recorded conversation between Richard and Carol. His voice, calm, deliberate, said he'd been watching David Vulture Peterson for years, biding time until he could take everything from me, just like he believed I took everything from him. Hearing my old call sign spoken aloud felt like getting sucker-punched by the past, but it made one thing brutally clear: this ended now, before Alina got hurt worse than she already had. I decided to confront Richard directly, but I wasn't doing it in secret. I wanted witnesses. I wanted this entire community to see what kind of man they'd elected to run their lives. The next HOA board meeting was Thursday night. Richard would be there, pitching more of his neighborhood security plans. Alina wanted to come, but I insisted she'd stay home. This was going to be explosive, and I didn't want her anywhere near the fallout. I spent 2 days prepping, gathering evidence, organizing documents, setting up the kind of public takedown that would strip the mask off Richard Harrison once and for all. I also chose my wardrobe carefully, a button-up with sleeves I could roll when the moment came to show who I really was. The meeting was held in the community center, a dull, aging building with peeling paint but plenty of seating. About 20 residents showed up, plus the 5 board members who'd rubber-stamped Richard's every demand. He was mid-speech about installing new surveillance upgrades when I walked in carrying a laptop and a borrowed projector from Elena's firm. Conversations died. Heads turned. Richard's face drained of color like a man who'd just seen a ghost with a grudge. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his tone stiff and rehearsed, "this is a closed board session. You'll need to submit concerns through proper channels." I plugged in the projector and smiled at him, a smile I'd learned in places where smiling usually came right before things went very wrong. "Oh, Richard," I said, voice calm and cutting. "Tonight, I am the channel." Then I hit play. Crystal clear high-def footage lit up the wall. Max and Jake ransacking my home, Alina begging them to stop, Carol filming it all with the delight of someone watching a fireworks show. The room sat frozen, horror spreading across every face. They didn't just watch a crime, they watched their trust crumble frame by frame. When the video ended, Richard tried to speak. I raised a hand and cut him off. That was my wife being assaulted by hired muscle under Richard Harrison's orders. That was felony assault, property destruction, and conspiracy to commit acts of intimidation. But before we talk about the law, let's talk about truth. I'd rehearsed this moment 100 times. I slowly rolled up my right sleeve, revealed the black and gold trident inked into my skin, the Navy SEAL insignia, small, faded, unmistakable. The scars around it said the rest. Jagged lines earned in deserts and jungles, not suburban lawns. The silence in the room was suffocating. "I served 20 years in the U.S. Navy SEALs," I said, voice commanding, call sign, Vulture. "I specialized in high-threat extraction and counterterrorism in places that never make the news. I've hunted warlords, dismantled insurgencies, and made it home when others didn't." Richard looked like a man watching his own funeral. His hands gripped the podium like it was a lifeline. But before he could speak, Carol snapped. Whether from guilt, fear, or survival instinct, he'll never know. She stood and shouted, "Stop lying. Richard, you said you knew who he was from day one. You said it was revenge for something overseas. And you made me help plan it." The room exploded into chaos, people yelling, standing up, demanding answers. I let it go for a moment before raising my voice just enough to slice through it. "Richard Harrison," I said coldly, "was dishonorably discharged from the U.S. Army 15 years ago for betraying his own. He sold classified data to enemy forces, got 2 good men killed, and nearly got the rest of us wiped off the map. I was the one who uncovered his treachery. I turned him in. Everything that's happened to my family in the past 6 months, that was his attempt at revenge." The room fell silent again, realization dawning like dawn after a long, dark night. It wasn't HOA drama. It was war in khakis and clipboards. I presented my demands with calm authority. Richard would resign immediately from all community roles. He'd issue a public apology to Alina and every resident he harassed. He'd pay for the damages he caused, both physical and psychological, and he'd cooperate with a full criminal investigation. "You have 24 hours to comply," I said, eyes locked onto his. "This is your only chance to settle this peacefully. I highly recommend you take it." Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out except a hoarse wheeze. The tyrant was gone. All that remained was a ghost wrapped in shame. Just then, Alina stepped into the room. She walked to my side, calm and strong, and faced the stunned residents. "It's time everyone here heard the truth," she said. "It's time we talk about what kind of leadership this neighborhood really needs. What was the real history between David and Richard? And why did Richard spend years fearing a man he'd pretended not to know? The full truth is about to hit you like a freight train. Hit that subscribe button and strap in for what's next, because this is no ordinary HOA story. Some enemies hide behind rules, others hide behind respect. The most dangerous kind hides behind both. The next 48 hours would reveal the full depth of Richard's betrayal, and his final act of desperation would force me to become the one man I never wanted to be again. Willowbrook wasn't a neighborhood anymore. It was a war zone. Alina and I, armed with declassified military records and first-hand knowledge, pieced together the whole ugly truth. Richard Harrison had once been my commanding officer. 15 years ago in Afghanistan, during what was supposed to be a basic recon mission, he sold our patrol routes for 50 grand. Taliban forces hit us like clockwork, perfectly timed, perfectly placed. It was a slaughter. 2 of my teammates' family, men with wives and kids, died in that ambush. 3 more were injured, including me. We spent 18 hours trapped, bleeding, hiding, because even the extraction routes had been compromised. I suspected betrayal immediately, but proving it took months. I studied patrol logs, hacked communications, traced wire transfers. Piece by piece, I built the case that ended Richard's career. Alina read the redacted court-martial transcripts in silence, her face growing pale. "David," she whispered, "he didn't just betray the mission. He betrayed you." She was right. He hadn't just sold out his country. He'd tried to erase the man who held him accountable, and now he'd come back for the sequel. This was never just revenge, it was unfinished business. And I was the only one left standing. The evidence wasn't just convincing, it was damning. Wire transfers to offshore accounts, encrypted messages with known enemy contacts, testimonies from paid informants who deliberately fed our unit false intel. Richard hadn't just betrayed us, he'd made a career out of it, living far beyond what any soldier on his salary should have. When investigators followed the money, what they found was staggering. A trail of calculated betrayal that jeopardized dozens of missions. But the vendetta didn't fully click into place until Alina uncovered something chilling: statements from Richard's own court-martial transcript, pages filled with unhinged rants about how I'd destroyed his future, sacrificed his career for the sake of dead men who knew the risks. He showed no remorse, no sense of brotherhood, no accountability, just one burning obsession. "I'll want David Peterson someday." One transcript read, "And I'll make him pay for ruining my life. He thinks he's a hero, but I'll show him what real consequences look like." Elena's hands trembled as she read the words out loud, and I could see it in her eyes. This wasn't about power or property. This was a 15-year-old war disguised as HOA harassment, and we were in the CROSSHAIRS. Richard responded to my public ultimatum just as I expected, with desperation disguised as strategy. Within hours, he'd retained a sleazy lawyer who billed himself as a veteran advocate, though his tactics involved painting combat veterans as unstable threats to polite society. He claimed I was mentally unwell, prone to violence, and dangerous to our community. He even filed for a restraining order, suggesting that Alina and I were the real problem in Willowbrook. It was a clever angle playing on suburban fears of broken soldiers with dangerous skills. But Richard made one fatal mistake. You can't unsee the truth once it's been burned into your conscience. The community had already seen who Richard really was, and the whispers of PTSD couldn't drown out the screams on that video. Then came Saturday night. That was when Richard crossed a line no man ever should. He hired 6-minute amateurs like Max and Jake. These were professionals, records full of priors, experience in jobs that don't get advertised or filed on resumes. I knew they were coming because I'd been intercepting Richard's communications since the HOA meeting using tools and methods I hadn't touched in years. Not exactly legal, definitely necessary. Their instructions were clear. Make it look like a home invasion gone wrong, but make sure we didn't survive it. This was no longer harassment, this was a kill order. So I did what I was trained to do. I prepared for war. Saturday afternoon, I turned our home into a fortress. Reinforced doors, escape plans, improvised defenses. Alina wanted to call the police. I told her that by the time they responded it would be too late. I showed her the safe room I'd built in our basement, walked her through it, reviewed emergency protocols, taught her basic defense enough to buy seconds if it came to that. "David," she said quietly as I checked the backup comms, "this is insane. We're talking about people trying to kill us in our own home." I paused and looked. At Hearth, a woman who married a quiet consultant and found herself married to a ghost from another life. Alina, I said, steady and calm, I'm going to keep you alive, whatever it takes, however far I have to go. You're making it through this night. They came at 2:07 a.m. They cut the power, jammed the signal, disabled lines, coordinated like professionals. 6 armed men, moving with the silent precision of military contractors. They thought they were dealing with civilians. They weren't. I'd been up for hours, watching them approach through thermal imaging gear. Elena's firm would never know I borrowed. I wasn't trapped. I was baiting them, and they'd just walked into their worst mistake. They thought they were hunting prey. They didn't realize they were walking into a wolf's den. The fight was fast, brutal, controlled. I used everything. A garden hose became a tripwire, the fire extinguisher, concealment, and a blunt force weapon. I moved through the darkness like it was daylight. Using the terrain, I'd landscaped myself, every hedge, every shadow against them. The first man went down hard, tripping on the wire and breaking his collarbone before he even saw me. The second was blinded and disoriented by a high-pressure blast of foam, then neutralized before he could scream. The others spread out, trying to adapt, but they weren't hunting a target anymore. They were being dismantled. The battle moved inside. Furniture shattered, walls cracked. But 20 minutes later it was over. 6 men, incapacitated. Me bruised, bloodied, and with a blade wound in my shoulder, reminding me that I wasn't 25 anymore. When Elena emerged from the safe room, she found me wrapping the wound with a kitchen towel, standing over 6 unconscious attackers zip-tied and ready for police pickup. She stared, calm despite everything. "David," she said, voice quiet but unshaken, "who were you before you became my husband?" I looked at her, this woman who'd just survived a kill squad and still had the clarity to document the scene with methodical precision. She photographed the weapons, recorded the license plates, and bagged enough evidence to trigger a federal investigation. She'd started this story as a victim. Now, she was my partner in defense. "Elena," I said, as we heard sirens closing in, "when this is over, when Richard is rotting in a cell, there are things I should have told you years ago, things about my past." She looked at me unafraid. Her eyes held no hesitation, only resolve. And then she said something I'll never forget. "David, I don't care who you used to be. I care about who you are now. And right now, you're the man who saved our lives." With Richard's final gambit exposed and me bleeding on the kitchen floor, will the truth finally set us free? Or will his lies about my past take root in a neighborhood already shaken? Let me know what you think. Drop your predictions in the comments. Sometimes, justice doesn't come from a courtroom. It comes when your enemy's lies collapse in front of the people they fooled. This isn't over. Not yet. But for the first time in 6 months, the truth is finally louder than the fear. The evidence wasn't just strong, it was damning. Offshore wire transfers, encrypted messages with known insurgents, paid informants feeding us false intel. Richard wasn't just corrupt, he was orchestrating betrayal like it was a second career. He'd been living like a man with no conscience and plenty of dirty money. And when investigators followed the trail, it revealed a pattern that had endangered not just one mission but dozens. The personal angle hit when Alina uncovered transcripts from Richard's court-martial, paragraphs of venom where he ranted about how I'd ruined his life for the sake of dead soldiers who knew the risks. There was no regret in his words, no brotherhood, no honor, just a festering obsession. "I'll find David Peterson someday," one quote read, "and I'll make him pay for destroying my career. He thinks he's some kind of hero, but I'll show him what real consequences look like." Elena's hands trembled as she read it. And in that moment, we both understood everything. The surveillance, the harassment, the intimidation had been part of a plan 15 years in the making. This wasn't about property lines or HOA violations. This was revenge. Cold, calculated, and deeply personal. Richard's response to my ultimatum came fast and predictably desperate. Within hours of the HOA meeting, he lawyered up, hired some low-grade shark who called himself a veteran advocate, but his tactics were anything but honorable. He painted me as unstable, PTSD rattled, dangerous. He even filed for a restraining order, claiming I'd threatened him with violence. The real strategy: turn my own service into a liability, play into the neighborhood sphere of trained men with dark pasts. It was a clever lie until people remembered the truth they saw with their own eyes. Because the community had already watched the video, they'd seen what Richard's men did to Alina. No rumor could bury that kind of evidence, but Richard wasn't done. That Saturday night he went nuclear. He hired 6 men, at amateurs this time, professionals, records full of jobs. These were the kind of guys who didn't advertise and didn't ask questions. I knew they were coming because I'd been monitoring Richard's come since the day of the HOA meeting. The gear I used wasn't exactly in the civilian manual, but it was necessary. The orders were brutal: make it look like a botched robbery, but eliminate all witnesses. That meant Alina and me. Richard had decided murder was easier than justice. And that meant this wasn't an HOA dispute anymore, it was war. I spent the day turning our home into a fortress, reinforced weak points, set traps, ran drills. Alina wanted to call the police. I told her by the time they showed up it would be too late. Instead, I walked her through the escape plan, showed her the safe room, ran her through basic defense maneuvers I prayed she'd never need. "David," she said, voice trembling, "this is insane. We're talking about people trying to kill us in our home." I paused, looked at her, the woman who'd married a man she thought left war behind. "Alina," I said, "I'm going to keep you safe, whatever it takes, however far I have to go. You're getting through this night." They came at 2:03 a.m. They cut the power, disabled the lamp, jammed our signals. They surrounded the house like professionals, 6 armed men moving with tactical precision, thinking they were walking into a clean kill. They were wrong. I'd been watching them for hours, tracking their heat signatures through thermal imaging Elena's firm would never know I owned. And I wasn't asleep. I was waiting. They didn't know it yet, but they were walking into the wrong damn house. The ambush was swift, precise, controlled. I used a garden hose as a tripwire caught the first man between trees. The fall cracked his collarbone and took him out before he knew what hit him. The second ran into a blast of pressurized chemical foam, blinded and gasping. He never saw me coming. I took him down quietly with techniques Elena definitely wasn't supposed to witness. By the time the others realized this wasn't a hit, it was a hunt, I had already turned the battlefield in my favor. They tried to breach from the rear. I was waiting behind the arbor. They moved into the house, got split up. Tactical mistake. I used our ruined furniture as cover, kitchenware as weapons. The fight moved room to room, fast, relentless. Within 20 minutes it was over. 6 men down, my standing but blood running from a deep gash in my shoulder. Nothing fatal, just enough to remind me I wasn't 25 anymore. Alina emerged from the safe room to find me securing the last attacker with zip ties from my workshop, using a kitchen towel to stop the bleeding. She stared at me steady.com. Despite what she'd just lived through. "David," she said, "who were you before you became my husband?" I looked at her, this woman who married a consultant and woke up in a war, and I realized she deserved the whole truth. As we waited for the police, she went into full mission mode, photographing weapons, tagging plates, cataloging every piece of evidence we'd need to ensure Richard was finally held accountable. Watched her work, focused, methodical, fierce. The woman I met 6 years ago was gone. What stood in her place was someone unshakable. "Elena," I said, as sirens finally broke the silence, "when this is over, when Richard's behind bars, there are things about my past I need to tell you. Things I should have said years ago." She turned to me, no fear in her eyes, just fire. "David," she said, "I don't care who you were. I care who you are right now. And right now, you're the man who just saved our lives." With Richard's final play exposed and me bleeding in our kitchen, the question still remained: would the neighborhood believe the respectable HOA president, or the ghost of a man they never really knew? Drop your predictions in the comments. Sometimes justice doesn't come in a courtroom. It comes when a liar's mask is ripped off in front of the people he fooled. This war isn't over, but it's no longer a secret, and I'm done playing defense. ***. Thanks for watching another Rise Fuel original. If you enjoyed this story, smash that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. And remember, true power isn't in revenge. It's in rising above. ***. Subscribe and stay fueled for justice.